On a quiet highway rest stop, a truck driver thought he was just pulling over for a quick break. But what he discovered in the trees nearby would change his life forever. Hanging from a branch, left to die by a cruel hand, was a French bulldog. Most would have turned away, but what happened in the moments that followed will leave you speechless. This isn't just a story about rescue. It's about courage, second chances, and the unbreakable bond between humans and dogs. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss more inspiring stories like this one. The night was heavy with silence as David, a long-haul trucker, eased his 18-wheeler into a small, dimly lit rest stop on the edge of a forgotten highway in Kansas. His eyes burned from 12 hours of driving, and the only thing on his mind was a few minutes of quiet before continuing his route. The rain had just stopped, leaving the asphalt glistening under the weak glow of a flickering street lamp. The world smelled of wet earth and diesel fumes, the kind of combination that truckers grew used to after years on the road. David stepped out of his truck, stretching his stiff shoulders and breathing in the cool, damp air. For him, nights like these were routine. Just another stop, another lonely meal, another road stretching endlessly in front of him. He had lived like this for years. Endless miles, truck-stop diners, and nights where the only company he had was the sound of his rig's engine humming through the silence. But tonight, something felt off. The air carried a strange stillness, almost too quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He began walking toward the edge of the lot to shake the stiffness out of his legs when a faint sound caught his attention. At first, he thought it was just the creaking of branches swaying in the wet wind. But then, it came again. A weak, rasping noise, like the sound of something struggling for air. It was so faint he wondered if he had imagined it. Curiosity pulled him deeper into the shadows of the trees that lined the rest stop. His boots squelched in the wet earth as the faint glow of his flashlight cut through the darkness. He scanned the trees, the beam bouncing off slick bark and dripping leaves, until suddenly it landed on something that made his stomach drop. Dangling from a low tree branch, tied by a piece of worn rope around its neck, was a small French bulldog. Its body hung limp, rain-soaked fur clinging to its fragile frame, eyes half-closed as it fought desperately against the noose that cut into its throat. David's heart slammed against his chest. For a moment, he stood paralyzed, unable to believe what he was seeing. Who could do something so cruel? He rushed forward, fumbling with the pocket-knife he always carried. His hands shook as he slashed through the rope, catching the dog in his arms before it hit the ground. The bulldog's body was frighteningly still. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven gasps, each breath a battle against the darkness trying to claim it. David dropped to his knees in the mud, pressing his ear close to the dog's tiny chest, praying for the thump of a heartbeat. It was there, weak, faint, but still alive. "Come on, buddy. Don't you quit on me?" David muttered, his voice breaking as he gently rubbed the dog's side, trying to coax life back into him. "Not tonight." The bulldog's paw twitched weakly, as if responding to his voice. The small movement shattered something inside David. He could feel tears sting his eyes, an unfamiliar rush of emotion overwhelming the hardened trucker who had spent years alone on the road. He wrapped the dog in his jacket, cradling him close against his chest, feeling the fragile warmth of the animal's body seep into him. Back at the truck, David laid the bulldog on the passenger seat, his mind racing. Should he drive straight to the nearest town? Was there even a vet open at this hour? He didn't have answers, only one unshakable thought. He couldn't let this little dog die alone after surviving such cruelty. He turned the ignition and pulled onto the highway, the truck's headlights slicing through the darkness. The bulldog let out a faint whimper. It was barely audible, but to David, it was the most powerful sound he had ever heard. It was a plea, a promise, and a spark of hope all at once. David tightened his grip on the wheel, glancing at the fragile creature beside him. He had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. This night was no longer about delivery schedules or long-haul miles. It was about saving a life. And deep down, though he didn't yet realize it, This little French bulldog might just end up saving his two. The rain had returned, light at first, but quickly building into a steady downpour that battered against the windshield of David's truck. The wipers struggled to keep pace, squeaking across the glass as the road ahead disappeared into sheets of silver. David leaned forward, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his eyes flicking from the road to the small bulldog curled up in the passenger seat. The little dog's chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath sounding like it might be his last. His wet fur clung to his fragile frame, and his eyes, barely open, reflected a mix of exhaustion and pain. David had seen a lot during his years on the road. Wrecked cars, abandoned houses, and even people at their lowest points. But nothing had ever hit him quite like this. The thought of someone tying up a defenseless dog and leaving him to die gnawed at his chest like a physical ache. "Hang in there, buddy," David whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not gonna let you go." The glowing screen of his GPS offered little comfort. The nearest veterinary clinic was nearly 40 miles away in a small town called Fairview. 40 miles on a wet, twisting road, with every minute feeling like an eternity. David pushed the truck harder, the engine groaning as he urged it forward. The bulldog let out a weak whimper, so faint that David almost missed it over the hum of the engine and the pounding rain. He reached across the seat, his calloused hand gently resting on the dog's small body. He could feel the faint flutter of its heartbeat, fragile but present. That tiny thump kept David focused. Every mile seemed longer than the last. The rain turned the road into a slick ribbon of danger, and twice David felt the tires slide, his heart lurching into his throat. But he couldn't slow down. Not when every second might mean the difference between life and death for the little one beside him. Memories began to creep in as the miles passed. David had grown up on a small farm, where animals were part of daily life. His mother used to rescue strays, filling their barn with everything from abandoned kittens to injured birds. She had always told him, "Every life matters, no matter how small." David had rolled his eyes back then, too young to understand. But tonight, those words burned in his memory, echoing with every glance at the bulldog fighting for breath. As the glow of Fairview's streetlights finally pierced the darkness, David felt a rush of relief. He followed the GPS to a small building on the edge of town with a faded sign, Fairview Animal Clinic. The parking lot was empty, the lights inside dim. For a terrifying moment, David feared it was closed. He slammed the truck into park, scooped the bulldog into his arms, and dashed through the rain to the clinic's door. Locked. Panic surged through him as he pounded on the glass, shouting for help. A few agonizing seconds later, a light flicked on inside. A woman in scrubs hurried to the door, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, fatigue written across her face. She cracked the door open, frowning. "We're closed. Emergencies start in the morning." "This is an emergency." David's voice broke as he held out the limp bulldog wrapped in his jacket. "Please, he's dying. Someone tried to hang him. I cut him down myself. He won't make it till morning." The woman's eyes widened as she took in the sight of the dog. Her professional composure slipped, and without another word, she unlocked the door and ushered him inside. "Put him on the table now," she ordered, flipping on overhead lights. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air as she gathered supplies with practiced speed. "What's his name?" David froze. He looked at the bulldog, so small and fragile against the cold metal table. I don't know," he admitted softly. "I just found him." The vet glanced at him briefly, her eyes softening before she focused back on the task at hand. "Then we'll fight for him, name or no name." David stood helplessly by as the woman worked, placing an oxygen mask over the bulldog's muzzle, checking his heart, inserting in 4 with steady hands. The beep of the monitor filled the room, and David felt his own heartbeat syncing with the sound. Each beep a fragile promise of hope. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. David's fists clenched at his sides, his rough exterior cracking as he silently prayed, something he hadn't done in years. Finally, the vet exhaled and looked up. "He's not out of the woods yet," she said firmly. But he's stronger than I thought. He has a chance. David sagged against the wall, his eyes burning with relief. He glanced at the bulldog, who stirred faintly, his tiny paw twitching under the blanket the vet had tucked around him. That small sign of life hit David harder than anything. He didn't know why this dog had been left to die, but one thing was certain. Fate had put him in David's path for a reason, and now, David wasn't going to let him face the future alone. The waiting room of the Fairview Animal Clinic was eerily quiet. The hum of the fluorescent lights above and the occasional beep of machines behind the swinging doors were the only sounds filling the air. David sat hunched forward on the stiff plastic chair, his soaked jacket draped over his knees, his boots leaving muddy streaks on the linoleum floor. His thoughts raced as he stared at the closed door that separated him from the bulldog. The vet finally emerged, pulling off her gloves with a tired sigh. She looked younger in the light than David first thought, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much suffering. "He made it through the night," she said gently. "But he's still very weak. His airway was damaged, and he's dehydrated. He'll need intensive care for a while." David felt his chest unclench at the words he made it. But relief was short-lived. He knew what was coming next. The vet continued, "I'm not going to lie, it won't be cheap. Between treatments, medication, and keeping him here for observation, you're looking at a few $1,000s. David's heart sank. He was a trucker, living paycheck to paycheck, barely scraping enough to keep his rig running and food on the table. The idea of affording that kind of money was laughable. He rubbed his face with both hands, trying to think, trying not to imagine walking away. As if reading his thoughts, the vet leaned against the counter. "Look, I don't judge. A lot of people can't afford this. But he needs someone willing to fight for him. If you can't, I'll do what I can with donations. But his chances won't be the same." David looked up at her, eyes blazing with conflict. He had never walked away from a responsibility in his life. His mama had raised him better than that. She always told him, "When you start something, you finish it, no matter how hard it gets." Those words rang in his ears now, loud as thunder. The bulldog's fragile breathing echoed in his memory, that tiny paw twitching as if asking him not to give up. David swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Do whatever it takes. I'll figure it out." The vet nodded, almost relieved. "Good. He deserves a chance. I'll set up a payment plan if you're serious." "Serious as it gets," David muttered. But when she left, reality crashed in. He was already behind on bills, already drowning in expenses. How was he supposed to save this little dog and still survive himself? As he sat there, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from his dispatcher, reminding him of an early morning haul he couldn't miss. David's stomach twisted. He couldn't stay in Fairview forever, but he also couldn't abandon the dog. The door opened again, and a nurse stepped out carrying the bulldog wrapped in a soft towel. He looked even smaller in her arms, his dark eyes half open, but this time they focused on David. For the first time since that awful night, there was awareness in those eyes. The nurse placed him gently in David's lap. The bulldog whimpered, shifting weakly before pressing his little face against David's chest. That simple act broke something inside him. He stroked the dog's damp fur, whispering, "You're not alone anymore, buddy. I've got you." For the first time, David felt certain. This dog wasn't just some random stray he stumbled on. He was meant to find him, meant to fight for him, no matter what it cost. Still, the challenges loomed large. David thought about his next delivery, the long road ahead, the nights spent alone in motels and the cab of his truck. How was he supposed to care for a fragile animal when his life was already in chaos? But as the bulldog shifted in his arms, his faint heartbeat pressing against David's chest, the trucker realized something. The road had always been lonely, long stretches of asphalt with no one waiting at the end. Maybe, just maybe, that was about to change. The vet returned, holding a clipboard. "I'll need you to sign here if you're committing to his care. We'll need a name for him too. It helps us keep track." David hesitated, looking down at the tiny dog. The name came to him unbidden, as if whispered by fate. "Shadow," he said softly. Because he's not going to leave my side. The vet wrote it down, nodding. Shadow it is. David leaned back in his chair, Shadow cradled in his arms. For the first time in years, he felt the heavy weight of purpose settle onto his shoulders. It was terrifying, but it was also something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And though the road ahead would be full of struggles, one thing was certain. He and Shadow were in this together. The rain had stopped by the time David pulled his rig back onto the highway, but the clouds still hung heavy, swallowing the stars. In the passenger seat, nestled inside a small crate padded with blankets, Shadow slept, his breathing shallow but steady. Every few minutes, David glanced over, his heart tightening each time he thought the rise and fall of Shadow's chest had stopped. The vet had reluctantly agreed to let David take him, warning that travel could slow Shadow's recovery. But David had no choice. Missing a haul meant losing his contract, and without money, there would be no more treatments, no more medication. He promised the vet he'd keep Shadow warm, fed, and safe. But as the 18-wheeler rumbled down the interstate, David felt the weight of that promise pressing on him like the miles stretching ahead. At the first truck stop, David carried Shadow inside his jacket against his chest, drawing curious stares from other drivers. One man, tall and broad with grease on his hands, frowned as he noticed the weak little Bulldog. "What's a guy like you doing with a dog like that?" the man asked, his tone mocking. "That thing looks half dead. Should have let nature take its course." David stiffened, jaw clenching. He wanted to snap back, but instead, he simply pulled Shadow closer. "Not on my watch," he muttered, pushing past the man. But the words stuck with him. What if they were right? What if he was fighting a losing battle? Back in the truck, Shadow stirred and let out a faint whimper. David reached over and gently stroked his head. "Don't listen to them, buddy," he whispered. "We're gonna prove 'em wrong." The road stretched endlessly, and fatigue gnawed at him. At each stop, he improvised, feeding Shadow with a syringe of water and broth, letting him rest in his arms while he refueled. But the stress was wearing him down. 2 nights later, as he sat in the cab of his truck eating a stale sandwich, his phone buzzed. It was his sister, Emily. "You missed Mom's appointment again," she said sharply. "She asked about you. I didn't know what to tell her." David sighed, guilt crashing down like a wave. His mother, frail and living alone back in Oklahoma, needed him too. But here he was miles away, pouring everything into a dog he had just met. "I'm trying, Em," he said quietly. "I found this dog, he's been through hell. I can't just walk away." There was silence on the line before she spoke again, softer this time. "You've got the biggest heart of anyone I know. But you can't save everything, David. You'll break yourself trying." Her words echoed in his mind long after the call ended. He looked down at Shadow, curled tightly in the crate, his small chest rising and falling with fragile determination. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe he was breaking himself. But when Shadow opened his eyes and met his gaze, there was a spark there, faint but real. The next morning brought another challenge. At a way station, a state trooper spotted Shadow in the cab and frowned. "That dog doesn't look healthy. You sure he's fit to travel?" David bristled. "He's under a vet's care. I'm keeping him safe." The trooper studied him, then shrugged. "Just don't push him too hard. Looks like he's hanging on by a thread." When the officer walked away, David's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Everyone seemed to think Shadow's chances were slim. And maybe they were right. But David wasn't about to give up. That night, parked at a lonely rest stop under flickering lights, David cradled Shadow in his lap. The Bulldog shifted weakly, then licked David's hand for the first time. It was clumsy, barely more than a touch, but it sent a jolt straight through him. David chuckled softly, his throat tight. "There you are, Shadow. Thought I'd lost you for a minute." It was such a small gesture, but it felt monumental, proof that Shadow wasn't just surviving. He was fighting, and in that moment, David made a silent vow. No matter what the world said, no matter how heavy the burden, he and Shadow would face it together. Because sometimes, even when the road was long and cruel, all it took was a spark to keep hope alive. The highway stretched like an endless ribbon, the hum of the engine filling the silence. David had grown used to the rhythm. Drive, stop, care for Shadow, and push forward. Each day brought tiny victories. Shadow drinking a little more water, managing to stand for a few seconds before collapsing. But it also brought new fears. The Bulldog's ribs were still visible, his strength far from certain. Late one evening, after a delivery, David stopped at a roadside diner. He carried Shadow in with him, wrapped in a blanket. The chatter inside quieted as people noticed the frail little bulldog in his arms. Most just stared with pity, but one older woman approached. "Mind if I take a look at him?" she asked gently. She introduced herself as Ruth, a retired vet who lived nearby. David hesitated, but her warm eyes reassured him. She carefully examined Shadow, her hands moving with the confidence of years of practice. After a long moment, she sighed. "This little guy's been through more than neglect," she said softly. "These marks on his neck, they weren't from an accident. Someone tied him up, tight." For a long time, David froze, his stomach twisting. "You mean?" Ruth nodded grimly. "Yes, this wasn't just abandonment. This was cruelty. Someone wanted him gone." The words hit David harder than a punch. All the late nights, the exhaustion, the struggle, it wasn't just about saving a sick dog. It was about undoing the deliberate harm of a human being. Shadow hadn't simply been left behind. He had been betrayed. Ruth touched Shadow's paw gently. "He's fighting, though. Dogs like him, they don't give up easy. But you need to understand, his recovery won't just be physical. Trust is harder to heal than wounds." David swallowed hard, looking down at Shadow's big, dark eyes. For the first time, he saw something deeper there. Not just pain, but a flicker of fear mixed with hope. As they drove away later that night, Ruth's words echoed in his mind. Shadow wasn't just weak, he carried scars no one could see. And now, David realized, saving him meant more than food and medicine. It meant rebuilding a soul that had been broken. The revelation weighed heavily on him. Doubt crept in again. What if I wasn't enough? What if I failed him like everyone else had? The following day brought the test. At a crowded truck stop, a group of drivers gathered around as David tried to give Shadow some food. One man scoffed loudly. "Look at that thing. He's done for. Why drag around dead weight?" Another laughed cruelly. "Bet he won't last the week." David felt his blood boil, but before he could respond, something unexpected happened. Shadow, weak as he was, stood shakily on his paws. His legs trembled, but he planted himself firmly in front of David, baring his tiny teeth in defiance. The drivers chuckled at the sight of the frail bulldog trying to look fierce, but David didn't laugh. His throat tightened, his eyes burning. For the first time, Shadow wasn't just surviving, he was protecting. "Guess he's got more fight in him than you thought," David said quietly, his voice steady. The men muttered and walked away, leaving David to scoop Shadow back into his arms. His heart pounded as he whispered, "Good boy, Shadow. You showed them." But later that night, alone in the truck, the doubts returned. Shadow was improving, yes, but the revelation haunted him. Whoever had hurt this little dog was still out there, and the scars ran deeper than any of them could see. David knew then that this journey wasn't just about giving Shadow a second chance. It was about proving to the world, to Shadow, and maybe to himself, that broken things could be made whole again. And yet, a darker question lingered. What if the past caught up to them? What if Shadow's story wasn't finished with cruelty just yet? The thought left David staring into the night, the sound of the highway like a storm in his ears. Weeks passed, and with every mile on the highway, Shadow grew stronger. His once fragile body was filling out, his coat shinier, his eyes brighter. He no longer had to be carried everywhere. Now he could climb into the truck cab on his own, though David always offered a gentle boost. What hadn't changed was Shadow's habit of sticking close, as if afraid David might disappear. One chilly morning, David woke up in the truck's sleeper cab to find Shadow sitting upright, staring out the window at the rising sun. The sight made David smile. "You're really coming back, aren't you, buddy?" he murmured. But healing wasn't a straight path. Some nights, Shadow would still whimper in his sleep, kicking as if trapped in some nightmare. Other times, sudden noises, the slam of a truck door, the roar of an engine, would send him cowering under the seat. Those moments reminded David of Ruth's words. Trust was the hardest wound to heal. And yet, small miracles happened every day. At a delivery stop in Kansas, a little girl ran up to Shadow with a wide grin, holding out a piece of bread. For a moment, Shadow froze, ears back. David almost pulled him away, fearing he might panic. But then, slowly, the bulldog took a cautious step forward and accepted the bread from her tiny hand. His tail wagged, just once, but it was enough to make the girl laugh and clap her hands. David's throat tightened. He's learning to trust again. Still, shadows of doubt lingered. Money was tight, and the cost of food, medicine, and vet visits weighed heavily. David's own life as a trucker wasn't easy. Lonely roads, long hours, and constant exhaustion. Adding the responsibility of a fragile dog sometimes felt overwhelming. More than once, he caught himself wondering if Shadow might be better off in a stable home with someone else. The turning point came on a stormy night in Missouri. Rain pounded the windshield as David pulled into a rest stop. Exhausted, he leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. That's when he felt Shadow pawing at his arm, whining insistently. At first, David thought the dog was just restless. But when he followed Shadow's gaze, he noticed smoke rising from a nearby parked truck. Heart racing, David jumped out into the rain, with Shadow barking at his heels. Flames were spreading under the hood of the truck, and inside, a driver was slumped over the wheel. Without thinking, David yanked the door open and dragged the man out to safety, coughing from the smoke. Shadow barked furiously, circling as if urging David to hurry. By the time emergency services arrived, the worst had been averted. The man was shaken but alive. And David knew one thing for sure: if not for Shadow's sharp instincts, he might never have noticed in time. Back in the cab that night, soaked and trembling, David looked at the bulldog curled up beside him. "You saved a life tonight," he whispered. Shadow lifted his head and licked David's hand, as if to say, "We saved him together." It was then David realized. Shadow wasn't just a responsibility or a broken dog in need of saving. He was a partner, a companion who had given as much as he'd received. Still, as the storm passed and silence filled the cab, David wondered. Was this the final proof of Shadow's healing? Or was there still one last challenge waiting ahead? For the first time, though, David didn't fear the answer. Because whatever came next, they would face it together. Months rolled by, and the rhythm of life on the road began to feel natural for both David and Shadow. The bulldog no longer looked like the fragile, broken creature David had cut down from that tree. His muscles had grown firm, his stride confident, his eyes bright with curiosity. Wherever the truck stopped, Shadow trotted beside David, ears perked, tail wagging. One afternoon, David returned to Ruth's veterinary clinic for a checkup. As soon as they walked through the door, Shadow bounded forward, surprising everyone with his energy. Ruth laughed, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. "I can't believe this is the same dog," she said, eyes misting with emotion. "You gave him back his life, David." But David shook his head. "No, he gave me mine too." Because the truth was, before Shadow, David's life had been nothing but long stretches of asphalt and silence. He had carried a heavy loneliness, the kind that gnawed at him in empty motels and endless highways. Shadow filled that silence with presence, loyalty, and the kind of companionship David hadn't realized he needed so badly. Word of their story began to spread. Truckers across rest stops and diners recognized the little black bulldog with the wide chest and soulful eyes. People would come over to pet him, ask about him, and sometimes to share their own stories of loss, survival, and second chances. Shadow had become more than just a passenger. He was a symbol of hope. But the most emotional moment came one autumn evening when David parked his rig near a small-town festival. Children were playing, families laughing, and music filled the air. Shadow darted happily among the kids, letting them pet him, chasing after thrown sticks. David sat on a bench watching when a young boy approached. "Sir?" the boy said shyly, pointing at Shadow. "Is he yours?" David nodded with a smile. "Yeah, he's mine." The boy grinned. "He looks really happy." David swallowed hard, his chest tightening with emotion. Happy. That word, once unimaginable for Shadow, was now reality. And in that moment, David understood something deeper. Shadow hadn't just survived his cruel past. He had conquered it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the festival, David called Shadow back. The bulldog bounded over and leapt onto the bench, curling beside him. David wrapped an arm around him, whispering softly, "We made it, buddy. Against all odds, we made it." The journey had been filled with pain, doubt, and challenges, but it had led them here, to healing, to trust, to joy. David had set out to save a dog's life, but what he hadn't expected was how much that dog would save his. And as the night settled in, David knew with certainty, this wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of a new one built on loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his bulldog. Because sometimes the darkest beginnings lead to the brightest futures.